right, so today we are going to talk about ideologies and political parties. We're going to put those two topics in together. They work together quite well. Here's our agenda for today. So we're going to talk first about cleavages, or the basic divisions within a society, and how those get transformed into different ideologies, which then get transformed into political parties. And then we're going to talk more specifically about whether there's a decline in political parties here in Canada. So lots to get through, so let's just get started with cleavages and cleavage theory. All right, so cleavage theory, or the basic idea behind cleavage theory, is that a cleavage is a basic division in any society. So essentially, whenever you put a group of people together, they'll notice that there are differences, and that's where these cleavages will arrive, so these basic divisions. So two political scientists, Lipset and Roken, these guys right here, they noticed that since the Industrial Revolution, there's been probably about 4 main cleavages that have defined Western civilization that have been pretty consistent, especially in the development of European political parties. So the first one, they say, is between the center and the periphery. So the idea that there's a division between the elites in urban areas and those who live in more outlying areas. And so this usually expresses itself in terms of regional nationalism. So an example in Europe could be Spain, where a lot of regions have regionalist or separatist parties. For example, Catalonia has tried to separate a few times. And this division, according to Lipset and Roken, is caused by the creation of modern nation states, where you're kind of putting together a variety of different peoples into one country. Some states were better than others at assimilating these cultures together. And so you can sometimes find this center-periphery division, which then emerges certain political parties from there. The second is state-church, so a division between religious and secular voters. So in Europe today, there are still many Christian democratic parties, originally born of church involvement, now very much not with church involvement, but still the religious versus secular vote is a key cleavage that existed and can continue to exist in some countries. The next, we have owner versus worker, essentially a class cleavage. So this caused the formation of parties on the left and parties on the right of an economic spectrum, and we'll talk about what left-right means in a second. So this often can be called a conflict between the rich and the poor, and a variety of different parties have claimed to represent this interest, whether or not it's genuine. So the rise of socialism, for example, saying, we are going to be supporting the worker rather than the owner. The worker should have the means of production. The last one is urban versus rural, or land versus industry. So the idea of, is it industrial economic outputs or a more agricultural economic output? And this is especially true in the UK. And so Lipset and Roken argue in their seminal paper that these 4 main divisions are reflected in all of Europe's political parties. So the question is then, can we see these reflected in Canada today? So have a think. What are the major cleavages that exist today in Canada? What most divides us? So just jot down a few notes of what you think might be the most important cleavages. So here are some that previous students have come up with. The economy, the basis of the economy. So is it an oil-based economy like you see in Alberta versus industrial-based like you see in Ontario? And that could be a major division, is what is our economy based on? Religion. So there's actually a really interesting line of research that has demonstrated that Catholics tend to support the Liberal Party. Even as people become less religious, it's this relationship between Catholics voting Liberal seems to just always stand. And so this strangely persistent relationship is one that might be have something more to do with passing down of values, or we're not entirely sure there, but maybe religion does still exist as a cleavage in Canada. Language, so obviously the French-English debate is one that has existed in Canada since the very beginning. Separatism, we often think Quebec separatism, so are you separatist or nationalist, or federalist, sorry, but also in other countries there can be this kind of independent separatist movement. Diversity, so do you welcome immigration? Do you only welcome some forms of immigration? So there's a variety of different cleavages that might exist in Canada. And that's one question that, it doesn't quite fit into the models that Lipstick and Roken said, that our cleavages maybe are a little bit different than what was emerged in the original European parties. So Canada has its own unique cleavages. All right, so let's move on then to ideologies. So we're going to get a little more precise. So now, an ideology is essentially a coherent set of ideas about how people should live together, how they should function as a society, and then contains a plan of action for applying these ideas. So we often say that there's 4 key functions of an ideology. So the first is explanatory. So it's essentially how do people with this ideology think that the world works? It's kind of an empirical question. How does the world actually work right now? The second is evaluative, so deciding whether things are good or bad, so more of a normative debate. Orientation being where does the sense of identity come from? And then programmatic, so what do we want to do and how are we going to go about achieving that? So those are kind of the 4 key things about an ideology that we're going to talk about as we look at an ideological spectrum. So what is contained in any sort of ideology? What are some of the types of beliefs? So it can be beliefs about human nature. Are humans naturally good or not? Do they cooperate or not? Or are they inherently flawed and evil and dangerous? Should we be prioritizing the individual or should we be prioritizing the collective? Conceptions of freedom. So is it freedom from? So we're freedom from harm. Freedom from having your property confiscated, or is it freedom to? So like I have the basic social services so that I am healthy enough that I can be free to do X, Y, Z. So these are all, and there's many, many more of these ideas that are contained within an ideology. So the most basic way that scholars and political pundits, policymakers even have organized or understood different ideologies is through a left-right ideological spectrum. So the left-right scale here is essentially an economic line about how much control should the government have over economics. So it's this economic dimension. And we're going to talk later about how that can be expanded to other dimensions. But right now we're talking about an economic dimension. So you have over here in the right, where government should be very much hands off the economy, and over here on the left where government should be actively involved in managing the economy. So let's look now at 5 major ideologies that we can fit onto this left-right ideological spectrum, starting with liberalism. So liberalism we kind of tend to put in the center, and this is of course liberalism as an ideology, not necessarily the Liberal Party, just to clarify. You'll see that they're not necessarily the same thing. So classical liberalism desires a free, open, tolerant society that views human beings as essentially rational and able to recognize and promote their own self-interest. And because of that, it means that we want equality of opportunity and we want liberty for people to go about doing what they can to improve themselves. And again, it's this idea of classical liberalism as opposed to modern liberalism, which is very much moves into the domain of socialism. So just to clarify that we're not talking about the Liberal Party, we're talking about a classical conception of liberalism. All right, so let's look at those 4 basic ways that we understand ideologies. So first, explanatory. So they say, classical liberals at least, would say that social conditions are the result of individual choices and actions. So the way they see the world working is that individuals make decisions, and social conditions are a product of those decisions. Evaluative, or for example, this idea of is this good or bad? They would say that societies work best when individuals are free to do what they want, as long as they're not harming or violating rights of other people. We should generally let human beings be free because they're generally going to be able to make good decisions. And again, so they believe that human beings are rational, self-interest, and therefore equal. And so their programs would be about programs that promote individual liberty. And in more welfare-style liberalism or more contemporary liberalism, we also often see as well programs that are designed to promote equality of opportunity. So the idea being that everybody should get the same level of education so they have freedom to go and be self-interested and go work towards their ends. So it's important to remember that liberalism has changed how we conceive liberalism, but in a very classical sense, it's the idea that individuals should be free to do as they wish because they are rational, they are self-interested, and they're going to work towards their ends. So I guess now let's move to the left, socialism. So socialism recognizes some flaws in liberalism. That you can't really have equal people unless there is economic equality. And so it really sees that there are social classes and that there are people who are not equal because of this, and that political power is not resting in the people. So essentially they see the world in reference to economic and class relationships. That's the explanatory part of socialism. So the evaluative part, they see that these economic divisions are exploitative, and that this can impact the health of a society, is that these sharp economic divisions are exploiting certain people. So they see people that as in terms of their economic and class position, and say, okay, well, we need to do something about this. So the programmatic element of socialism is that policies need to be put in place to advance economic equality. And that is required for true political equality. You need to have everybody economically equal. So there's socialism in a nutshell. And then if we move even further over to the left, we get communism. So those who kind of ascribe to this belief actually believe that society started out in a primitive form of communism. But then we saw the rise of slave-based empires, feudalism, capitalism, and this primitive form of communism that we were meant to have was kind of disappeared. And so they see class conflict as the engine of history, and that there's going to be this historical progression, and that today's capitalism, which is based on profit and based on exploitation, so we need to overthrow that in order to get back to this idea of primitive communism. So how do they see the world? They see the world based on social conditions that are determined by economic and class relations, and they see these sharp class divisions in different stages of development. So like socialism, they think people should think of themselves in terms of their class position, and that policies, the programmatic idea is that policies must be put in place to advance this movement back towards communism, to have communist revolution so that we can really get back to a classless society and get back to true equality. And we're going to talk in a second about the differences between communism and socialism, because oftentimes it's quite difficult to understand, okay, where does one start and the other one stop? Or where does one stop and the other one start? There we go. So that's the left side of the spectrum. It's the idea that government really needs to be getting involved in the economic reality of a country in order to promote equality and promote the betterment of human beings. So let's move now to the right. So right of liberalism, we'll see conservatism again, conservatism as an ideology, not the Conservative Party. So this idea that humans are imperfect. So rather than these super rational, self-interested humans like we see in liberalism, they see that human beings are actually quite imperfect. And so we really have to focus on our existing customs and traditions as this latent wisdom that can help us as a society. So it's very much focused on conserving or keeping this existing social order that we've had. And they accept that there's going to be some inequality, but that's going to come with order, and actually the ability to have actual freedom is if we have order and we're actually able to therefore do things. So they see the world as the social conditions are the result of human imperfections, be that intellectual imperfections or moral imperfections, and they question the success, or success is a question of social order and harmony. And so everybody should be acting as part of a greater whole, and we should think of ourselves we should, as part of a society, so not just having the self in mind like you'd see in liberalism, where the individual is rational and self-interested, but we need to think about the greater whole. And so it suggests very slow and cautious change so that we don't get rid of the latent wisdom that might exist in customs and traditions. And then if we move even further to the right, we move into fascism, obviously epitomized by Nazi Germany. It's the idea is that the society is more important than the individuals. It's about society over the individual. So it's a rejection of democracy often, and very much interested in elitism, statism, militarism, and sometimes hyper-nationalism or racism. So the nation or the people as this determining identity. So again, moving away from the individual and moving into the collective, the idea of a nation or of a people as being the most important. So oftentimes they will, therefore, fascist regimes will see other people or the other as enemies of the nation or people. There'll be oftentimes scapegoats that are seen as the reason for the fall of this particular nation or these people, and that the way to get over that is to have strength and unity as a specific nation, as a specific people. So you're supposed to be defined not as an individual, but part of that nation or people. So the programmatic element then is that to establish a fascist elite who has uncontested power, who can bring the people back to this glory. So, Mussolini, for example, a fascist leader, his slogan was "Believe, obey, fight." So you can see the components of this idea of seeing yourself as part of a nation and therefore obeying your leaders and fighting for your nation. So some common questions. We're going to move to ideological spectrums, other ones. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to take a look at quickly is the fact that obviously the left-right ideological spectrum is very simplistic. It considers pretty much only the economic ideas. And we know that society is more than just what we think about the economy. So maybe it's less than a line and more of a circle, and you can see that here with a political circle. The idea that when you get super far left or super far right, you actually end up having the same sort of ideologies. It's going to actually look quite similar. So extreme communism and extreme fascism end up looking the same, and this particular one calls it a lunatic fringe. You can also see, more commonly, you'll see this two-dimensional ideological spectrum where you have the left and right, economic spectrum, but then you have this authoritarian libertarian spectrum. So it makes it clear that there is, how much control should we have over the moral side of individuals in the state versus on the extreme end of libertarianism, which is where everybody's just free to do what they want, that government shouldn't be intervening. So this is a very common grid or a two-dimensional spectrum that we'll see again later in this lecture. Okay, so discussing the extreme ends. So I'm going to send you to two different videos. So the first one is going to discuss what is the difference between communism and socialism. I often get that question from students. So how about you pause the video now, go take a look. It's a quick video that tries to explain the difference between communism and socialism. And come back and we'll discuss. So welcome back. So as we see here, socialism is often seen as a transitional stage until full communism can be achieved. So according to some of the great communist activists, revolutionaries, they would say, okay, well, socialism is just a step towards achieving full communism. So what's the main difference then? Well, socialism exists where the democratic state holds means of production, workers are going to get wages, but then those are used to contribute to the greater good, from which they derive what they need. So for example, you could say, social services, free healthcare, that's socialism, in the sense that everyone's contributing to it and then can derive from it what they need. Communism, however, has total collective ownership of everything. So no more private property. Everyone's just contributing and then taking what they need. So it's an more extreme form of socialism, kind of taken it to its logical conclusion. And this video in particular says, well, we haven't actually seen real communism. What those states that we think of as communist are actually just extreme socialists. The second question that we get is, okay, well, we often think of fascism in terms of Nazi Germany, but is there a resurgence in fascism and fascist ideology today? So I'm going to send you over to a video about contemporary politics in Italy and a potential resurgence of fascism. So take a look at that, and then we'll discuss it. So welcome back. This video is talking about the resurgence of fascist ideology in Italy. So it's this return to an appeal of nationalism, traditional family values, law and order imposed through strength. And so they were talking about this particular episode at a sports stadium, but there's also been examples of a beach that opened that was just for real Italians. There's an example of a town mayor near Rome erecting a statue to a fascist general. So there obviously seems to be this undercurrent, and it's not just in Italy, it's actually similar phenomena that are cropping out throughout Europe and throughout the world that are harkening back to these fascist ideas. So why is that? Scholars are discussing that still. It's possibly an issue of poverty and perhaps more importantly inequality between population groups, that there are some people who just the level of inequality between the rich and the poor is just so huge that people are lashing out in a way that they can. It could also be austerity politics, so the idea of cutting services to deal with financial crises, an increase in immigration and diversity happening at the same time, and people trying to find ways to deal with that and make sense of that. So definitely the extreme ends of the spectrum still exist. They are not only an early 20th century phenomenon, and are still things that we have to grapple with as global citizens. So this puts us now to where we can talk about political parties themselves. So what are political parties? So essentially they're manifestations of different ideologies, of different cleavages, to bring these sorts of ideas into government. So what do political parties do? So there's a few main functions of political parties in any society. So this is not just specific to Canada. So the first is to recruit and train political leaders. So we know that nearly everyone who becomes an MP in Canada, for example, does it through a party nomination process. Especially if you have a proportional representation system, the party is going to be choosing who are these actual individuals who are going to be serving in government. So one of the key functions is to recruit and train these political leaders to build up the actual people who are going to be running government. It's also a means of political organizations. So they help us in Canada, for example, how we organize parliament, how we select the prime ministers, all based on political parties. So it tends to be the party with the most number of seats that their leader becomes prime minister. So parties are essential to our understanding of political organization. They also serve as an educative function. So they debate major issues. They try to inform the citizenry to get them to vote for them. So they do a lot of education about elections. Think about during an election, where do you get most of your information from? Well, it's parties making lots of noise and trying to get people mobilized. So they have this educative function as well. They're also involved in interest aggregation. So this just means essentially that they bring together different interests or different beliefs into one comprehensive platform. So it's very hard, if you're just focused on one issue, you don't understand necessarily what kind of sacrifices in other areas are going to be needed to be made in order for that to become a reality. That's one of the kind of main functions of a political party, is that it brings together all of these various interests into one comprehensive platform that takes into consideration the trade-offs that are going to be required to get one thing done versus another thing. And then the final thing being policy input and linkage between citizens and government. So that's what this diagram is trying to represent, this linkage function. The idea that parties are designed to create policies, but also be a way of bridging citizens with their government. So let's look at this video specifically about political parties in Canada. So pause. Here's 3 questions to jot down notes about while you're watching this particular video, and we'll come back and discuss it. So welcome back again. So there's 3 questions that I wanted to talk about this video about party politics in Canada. So first of all, why are political parties important for governance in Canada? And so we talked about this in the main functions, the idea that they're providing this link between citizens and the government. And in Canada in particular, they're really important when we organize government, when we decide who's going to be the Prime Minister, for example, that it's generally the leader of the party with the most seats in the House of Commons. And so the party is choosing their leader, and that leader then becomes Prime Minister. So while they're not written in, they to kind of the rule books in terms of Canadian politics, we know that they play a huge role in actually forming, okay, who's going to be actually the Prime Minister, who's going to be in government. So how do citizens influence party politics or party policy? There's a few ways you can do that. The first is through party or candidate leadership. So if you become a member of a party, you can vote for who you want to be the leader. And that's pretty unique in the sense that, or special at least, in the sense that you are getting to potentially choose who's going to be Prime Minister just through choosing the party leader. Also, local candidates are chosen through a party apparatus. You can also influence party policy perhaps through party conventions, which are meant to gather input from party members regarding policy. The question, of course, is this really how platforms, when it comes to elections or party programs, are actually built? Questionable. In the end, you know, the central party tends to be doing most of the decision making there, but ideally there is this way of ordinary citizens deciding how what the party's policies and platforms should be looking like, and that's through party conventions or policy input processes. And then the last question, which should be familiar to some of you, is this party discipline issue. So party discipline is when party members in the House of Commons are expected to vote together, particularly on important matters like budget bills. And if not, you get kicked out of caucus, and good luck winning the next election without having a party to support you. So Canada actually has some of the strongest party discipline around the world. It's quite strong compared to other places. You know, the foil we often use is the United States, where there's much weaker party discipline. All right, so another key thing about Canadian parties that are worth noting, because they're not necessarily the same in other countries, is the fact that we have what we call a franchise model of party politics. So this is something that Ken Carty, a political scientist, has written about. And he says it's kind of like a franchise of any major business. So let's say, for example, there's a McDonald's. There's going to be a national headquarters, and they're going to decide, you know, the basic overarching ideas. They're going to be involved in deciding what's on the menu and keeping things consistent among all the McDonald's. There's regional associations, and then there's each franchise of the McDonald's brand is its own independent restaurant, kind of not really independent, but its own restaurant, but that they're serving the menu of that the main HQ of McDonald's has chosen, and they keep this brand going. But they can also do their own kind of community activities, their own little fundraisers, that kind of thing. But they're very much a lot of what they do is dictated by the national party headquarters. And so this is how he says we can help understand how Canadian parties work. So there's a national party headquarters. So for example, the Liberal Party of Canada, there'll be a party leader. So somebody who has leadership of the party, and then if that party gets the most seats, it becomes Prime Minister, usually. And there's also a party president involved in kind of the day-to-day operations of the party. They're going to support the party in government, so in the House of Commons in Ottawa, and take charge of the national campaign. Now, in the Liberal Party, for example, there are regional party associations as well. So, for example, the Liberal Party of Canada, Ontario. So they're going to oversee all of the constituency associations, which we're going to see next, and represent the interests of the region to the national party. And then the lowest in this kind of three levels of parties in Canada, is the constituency associations. That would be, for example, the Kingston and the Islands Federal Liberal Party Association. So they'll be involved in their local candidate selection, the election campaign in the riding specifically, so the door knocking and whatever for the actual individual candidate. They'll support the MP or the candidate through social events or consultation processes. But again, very much there's a hierarchy in that there's a relationships between each of these levels of the party. And so when we think of a political party in Canada, it's not just one monolith. We often think of just the political party headquarters, but actually in Canada we have lower level political party associations that are also active and have some leeway in what they do. Note, provincial parties are separate. So like the Liberal Party of Ontario is a completely different beast, the exception being the NDP, which has a combined structure. So just fun fact. So where then do we put Canadian parties on an ideological spectrum? So here's two ideological spectrums. I talked a little bit about this two-dimensional ideological spectrum where we have the economic spectrum and then we have the more social spectrum. So this is one over here done by Political Compass, and we're going to do that in class, and kind of where they put each of the parties according to this two-dimensional political spectrum. So you can see conservatives, for example, on the right and also towards the authoritarian side of the spectrum versus, for example, the NDP, which are kind of moving closer to this libertarian side and closer to the left. So this one over here on the left is by Vote Compass. So this is actually, CBC puts this out in coordination with some academics and Vox Pop Labs, I believe it's called. So this is one where you go in and you take a quiz, and then they've also placed where each of the parties would be. So it's hard, though, to compare these two because they've kind of flipped it. So I just kind of rotated the entire graphic for you. And essentially, they kind of put a lot of these parties over here a lot further over onto the left side. But you can generally see the same sort of trend between parties. Now, why is it that these parties are further over to the left here? It could be because this is kind of built for Canada. This is built for around the world. And so, you know, it's just like a snapshot of moved in closer of this part of the ideological spectrum. But as you can see, you know, two different organizations or websites have different classifications of where parties stand on the ideological spectrum. So it's very much an area for debate. And there are scholars who spend their entire career trying to figure out from a party platform where they fit on an ideological spectrum. I am not one of those scholars because it is a can of worms. So, so that's where we might fit our Canadian parties. So one thing you'll notice is that Canadian parties tend to be pretty clustered around the center. We put a lot of Canadian parties somewhere in the middle because we call them brokerage parties. So the main parties in Canada are trying to combine as many different groups and interests together in order to get electoral support. So we know from different electoral systems that the first past the post, you either win everything or you win nothing. So the idea is, as a party, what I want to do is I want to capture as many voters as possible. And so if I believe that the center of the political spectrum is where I'm going to be able to get as many parties as possible, or as many voters as possible, that's where I'm going to be because I'm interested in getting power. So we often use this idea of parties in Canada being big tents. So they're a big tent that tries to encompass a lot of different cleavages. Be that a religious cleavage, English-French language cleavage, center-periphery, economic cleavage, moral issues cleavages. And the idea is that they're trying to encompass as many different cleavages as possible and have them all under their big tent in order that they can get as much electoral support as possible in each of the ridings and therefore have a better chance of winning government. So the idea behind brokerage politics is that you're making all of these coalitions between different groups, trying to get them all under this big tent before the election. We'll talk about this more when we talk about electoral systems, but this idea, there's this idea that the first past the post system encourages that because rather than making coalitions after, so it's like a coalition government, after the election, like you see in countries where there's a lot more parties and there's a proportional representation system, and then after the election, they'll, okay, now who's going to work with who to make government? What we tend to do in Canada is we make those coalitions before the election, because you want to appeal to as many people, because only one party or one person can win in each individual riding. So that's brokerage politics, and we often will say that Canadian politics is really defined by this brokerage politics. Okay, so last thing I want to deal with today is this question of, well, are parties even important anymore? This is kind of one of those academic debates that scholars have been thinking about. Are political parties really even a thing anymore in Canadian politics? Obviously, they exist, but does real party politics make any difference? Does it even matter if you decide to join a political party or not? So remember, we talked about political parties as linking citizens with government. So we call linking citizens with political parties the representation function, and parties with government as the governance function. So let's look at the arguments for and against political parties being important or not important anymore in Canadian politics based on these two ideas of representation and governance. So are parties important? So let's look at representation first. So arguments on the side that parties are on decline. So the first of these would be the professionalization of politics. So by this we mean that parties now use political professionals, so like consulting firms, we could call them mercenaries, call centers, direct mail, opinion polling, the media, instead of party members, in order to learn about public concerns and to spread the party message. So whereas back in the day you would actually need to have on the ground party members spreading the message, getting information, now you can just do a public opinion poll. You can just do a direct calling. You can send out an email blast or put something up on Facebook. And so there really isn't this need anymore for parties to fill this linkage with society, because parties can directly go to, or the party in the central headquarters can go directly to the individual. Additionally, there are new avenues of political action for individuals. Back in the day, if you wanted to be politically active, generally you join a political party as a way to do that. But now there are individual ideological business or interest groups that can get involved in politics. Candidates can also somewhat, in some ways, receive money from political action committees, or not money, but more like support and marketing from them. So parties also, because of the role of campaign finance regulations today, so you don't necessarily, third parties now can spend on elections, and these third party groups might actually be involved in this activism during an election. Or one might even argue that citizens might not even need a group in order to be politically active. We call this cognitive mobilization, the idea that citizens can participate politically themselves without needing to look at political cues or look at parties as an intermediary, that they can be involved in their own way. So this would be an argument that, political parties as like the club that you go join that then influences elections, maybe not really what we thought it was, or what it was in the past. Now, the flip side of this is, well, yes, political parties are quite important, and that might be because of the local candidate selection process, which is all done within the party apparatus. So, quick aside, how do you become a candidate for a major party in Canada? So, here's the process. So first you have to decide you want to run. So, can I take time off school or work to run? Do I feel like I have the right stuff to run? Okay. Great. So then you decide, where do you want to run? So you must live or have property owned or rented in that riding. So you decide, I'm going to run for Kingston and the Islands. Then you decide which party you want to run for. So not everyone comes up through the party ranks. It's not like you have to have been a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party for your entire life to run for the Conservative Party. Some people might be local, people who are well-known in the local politics scene. They might be just people who are active in local affairs, and they just get to purchase a party membership so they can run with that particular party. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a long-run attachment to the party. So next, scope out your chances. Is there an incumbent, meaning somebody who already holds that seat who's going to be running again from your party. If so, good luck getting through the nomination process. You really can't, the party is going to pretty much automatically say, okay, these people can run again as our candidates. Is it even worth running? Is this a competitive riding? And do I have any chance of really winning? Then you're going to figure out your party's nomination rules. There's usually some sort of a fee involved, and you start raising money to help with nomination expenses. Nomination expenses are not tax deductible, so it's actually quite difficult to ask people for money for this because they're not getting a tax receipt for it. You're going to want to campaign to the existing members that are in the party, but more importantly, perhaps you're going to be signing up new members to vote for you. So you'll have a deadline, a cutoff period where nobody who's joined the party after that period of time, after that deadline, gets to vote in the leadership selection. But before that, you can just sign up everybody and their dog. Well, not their dog, but you get the drift. To get them to then say, like, hey, like, I know that you are my friend, so you're going to come and support me. So that's where parties get most of their membership, is during these candidate nomination processes, where candidates will go around to everybody they know and say, okay, sign up for the party just so you can come and vote for me. All right, so what's next? On nomination day, get your supporters out to the polls. So you might be involved in calling everybody and being like, hey, Joe, you haven't gone out to vote yet. Like, can I come give you a ride? You're going to either concede your loss then at the end of the day or celebrate your victory, essentially. Did you get the nomination? Then there's some paperwork to fill out from Elections Canada, and then if you are the winning candidate, there's official nomination procedures with Elections Canada to get you and your party on the ballot. So that's a little aside on how you become a candidate. The point being is candidate selection is very much embedded within this political party process. It's all done within the political party. And so in that sense, the local party and party membership is so key to who are the actual people who are going to be in these seats in the House of Commons. Additionally, local campaigns can be important. So somebody like Ken Carty, who we talked about earlier, he wrote this beautiful piece called The Politics of Tecumseh Corners. And I'm going to give you a quote from this. He says, okay, so this is a quote actually from Stephen Leacock, as quoted by Carty, that people who have only witnessed gatherings such as the House of Commons at Westminster and the Senate in Washington have never seen a conservative convention at Tecumseh Corners or a liberal rally at Concession Schoolhouse don't know what politics mean. So people who have only seen the politics of the House of Commons or of, what you see in Ottawa might not really understand the local aspect of politics. As a liberal rally in a local area, or a specific convention in a local area, that these are so important, and that local party activists do a lot of work, especially in campaigns. The on-the-ground campaign, the door knocking, the mobilizing people out to vote in these individual ridings is done by local people. A lot of them can't afford to hire mercenaries to do that for them, and so local volunteers matter a lot. And so political parties, therefore, are super key to local campaigns. And we know that in Canada, we are not directly electing the Prime Minister. We are electing local representatives. And then the last thing is the changes in campaign finance and lobbying laws. Well, in some ways, that has contributed to the decline of parties, in the sense that there are third-party interest groups that can spend and can be involved in campaigns in limited ways. There's also been limits on campaign finance contributions, so how much you can donate. And because of that, you really need to rely on a lot of smaller donors, ideally at least, in order to fund your campaign. So that means that these individual party members are super important for funding political parties in their campaigns, because you can't just have one person randomly donate $1 million. That's not allowed. You need to have a lot of smaller donations of a few $1,000s at a time in order to fund the party process. So those are the arguments on both sides when it comes to representation. So let's look at governance, so the side of linkage with the state. So here are some of the arguments why parties might be on decline. So one of these is brokerage politics. It's the idea that Canadian political parties have kind of lost ideology because they're trying to bring everybody into this big tent that we talked about earlier. And so really, what does a political party stand for or mean anymore? The big parties just look really, really similar because they're all trying to capture as many votes as possible, and the way to do that is to get as many groups into your big tent as possible. The other issue is the centralization of policy formation and leadership. So we know that policy formation, even though ideally should be coming from some sense of party policy convention or whatever, we know that they are getting decided at the central level. And so really the local party doesn't have much say when it comes to policy and what's going to get brought into a party platform and therefore into a party program when they're in the House of Commons. And the last one is party discipline. So the central party makes decisions. We have strong party discipline in Canada, and local MPs are largely expected to follow what the central party tells them to do. So even if their constituents are really active in the party and have ideas and suggestions, how much can they really bring that into what's going on in the House of Commons? That's a question. The only real argument that, yes, parties are still important when it comes to governance, or individual party membership is still important when it comes to governments, is, well, maybe we've just had a change in expectations, that we want more of a say in what's going on in the House of Commons than we're getting, and we want more of a say on the big national issues than we might have previously. So that's kind of one argument that Carty makes in terms of, well, yeah, parties are still important, it's just that we've changed our expectations. I think that's a pretty weak argument, but it's the only one really on that side. So these are some of the arguments that we might see regarding the original idea of a party as being party membership, and you have actual individuals involved in local activism and party membership, versus now seeing much more centralization and professionalization of the political party. And so that's a key academic debate that we have about, do political parties really matter as actual mass organizations, or are they just a professional thing that exists in Ottawa that is really calling the shots? So I think that's it for now. So we are going to head over to the quiz, and from there we will see you in class.